See, you see, on the one hand, the people who benefited from education, who came over, they had nothing, they settled, they married, got jobs, and did well, quote. But there was always a tinge of sadness in it somewhere. There's homesickness is one of the underrated sicknesses. But then there were the people who, you know, who didn't make it. But the saddest of all immigrants, and the worst of them, is the whole question of someone who's in jail abroad. That's really emigration at its worst.
Over the past 25 years, as so many other people turned away from prisoners, washed their hands of them, it was the hands and heart of ICPO that created a kind of bridge to the future for prisoners and for their families. The work of ICPO let each individual prisoner and their families know that they had an innate dignity, a dignity that no system could ever overwhelm, and indeed no act of their own could ever obliterate. And that's a very important statement also. And then as families try to juggle with things like distance, unfamiliar places, judicial systems, different languages, big money worries, the harsh reality of imprisonment, the effects on family life, and the effects too on a person's life chances, the chances for future employment, all of those things. In that kind of turmoil, in that chaos, it was very important that there would be a rock that people could lean on. And ICPO made itself that rock. In the doing of this work, there is an honouring of that great phrase from St. Matthew's Gospel, "I was in prison and you visited me." It was Martin Luther King, I think, who once said that darkness is only driven out by light. And 25 years ago, a very small group, very, very small group of men and women lit a light that has quietly, and I think very emphatically, helped to drive out a lot of darkness in lives.
I understood that what had been drawn up at that time was an attempt to deliver a service to prisoners and their families, but not just to have it as a fire brigade service really, but to try and also research the underlying causes of the problems and to try and build up an evidence base for the work that was needed, and then to try and lobby on the issues that the research would throw up. So it was a very different approach. It was an approach that was way ahead of its time in promoting an evidence-based approach, which is now kind of very contemporary language. But it wasn't just evidence and leaving it at that, it was also then the passion and the commitment that came behind it, from particularly Stacia Crickley, who had carried out the research initially with, I think it was about 20 families and the prisoners. So the key bit there was that they had listened and heard what it was that prisoners were identifying as the issues that affected them and the families as well. And so then when they decided to set up a service in the context of the Bishop's Commission for Emigrants, that it would be geared very much to addressing those needs. So I think it was a really good start. It was based on the practice and the reality that families had already been facing.
The summer of 83 or 84, I can't remember which actually, but we could always look that up. I undertook a very small piece of research which involved speaking to the families of a variety of prisoners from different contexts and different backgrounds, and asking them about what they felt the issues were and how their issues, how they could be supported, and what sort of things would improve the situation they were in. And the sort of things they came up with were very straightforward, and they were actually the sort of things which played a major role in the development of ICPO in the beginning as well. There were things like visiting and the process of the visit, the right to some social welfare support, both for visiting and for ongoing family support, the difficulties in travelling between Ireland and the UK, which were pretty difficult for a number of people at that point in time. So the sort of things that emerged were about straightforward support, about advocacy on behalf of the prisoners, about the rights of prisoners in difficult situations, in different jurisdictions where the families were totally unfamiliar with the way the legal setup was actually being organised and what was being done on their behalf, or even straightforward information about consular services, how to get in touch with them, alerting them to what was happening for prisoners and all of that sort of thing.
The big problem was that people were being detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and they were being held, and some people were convicted. So that was causing a great amount of fear in the Irish community, and people were trying to cope with that and wondering how to express themselves. The whole government was saying that we're given the impression that if you're Irish, you're guilty. And it was hard to get that across to the British government and also the Irish government.
Families coming in to visit and mothers just broken-hearted because they knew the son was in prison, and there were only maybe young fellas who had gone over for a trip to Butlins.
And the office was like a drop-in centre here, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, yeah. And you'd just sit talking to them, and then others would come in and they're very composed, maybe never had any experience of dealing with prison before. And, you know, halfway through the conversation, you realise they were just keeping a face on it, and they just break down with the distress of knowing that their son was going to be away for some time, you know. And sometimes the incidents were just because of racism. Had they been at home and had they been in a different setting, they would not have been in prison.
At any one time in Britain, there was about 1,200 people, Irish people in prison at any one time. Now, a lot of people think that the vast majority of those were Republican. They weren't. There's only about 50 Republican prisoners at any one time in Britain. You had a huge number of ordinary, simple, minor cases, but the big cases were the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and the organising of a campaign to look at the objective facts of this particular case.
One of the greatest things that I got was from a sister who was a chaplain in Wormwood Scrubs prison, Sister Agnes Hunt. I explained to her we were innocent. And the thing that always struck me was that Sister Agnes had said she wasn't here because I was innocent. She was here because I was imprisoned, and whether I was innocent or not was not the question. It's very hard for me to relate the importance of having someone on the outside supporting you, believing in you, not condemning you.
I think back to the Parade of Innocence when ICPO was very instrumental in helping to organise 10,000 people on the streets of Dublin in a candlelight parade to actually what it turned out to be marking was the release of the Guildford 4, but also stepping up the campaign for the Birmingham 6. And that was really a very, very important moment, and it was the first time, for instance, just as a sideline on it, but that artists came together to work with people who were trying to do advocacy work and trying to kind of build further supports for the campaigns, really. So that was a highlight to see the families reunited with the prisoners and them released after that many years, and also seeing Annie Maguire and, you know, the others getting their pardon as well. And it's just, it's almost unbearable to think of what her family suffered and what she suffered when her house and her young children were taken away from her. 17 years in prison for something she didn't do. It's just, we can't even imagine it.
Our offices were broken into, files were busted, all that sort of stuff. And that kind of stuff went on because here you had just a conflictual situation, and going to visit people like that in prison, like up the country and places like that, was kind of traumatic experiences, you know, for people going in, like myself and others, going in to visit people in prison. Cultural misunderstanding. Like I remember meeting one of the detective inspectors in North London, and we had a meeting with regards to the Irish community, etc. And we had a lot of those kind of meetings with the police to try to get an understanding between ourselves and the police in relation to the nature of the Irish immigration in Britain and Irish immigrants. And I remember one of the detective inspectors asking me, are those fellas that come out of Biddy Mulligan's around midnight singing them in behind the wire, are they members of the IRA? Well, I said, if they're members of the IRA, I said, you can sleep easily tonight.